What if the very moments when your faith feels weakest are actually the moments proving it has finally become real? This idea might feel uncomfortable, especially since many of us have learned to identify faith by its energy, certainty, momentum, and visible changes. We expect faith to feel alive in ways we can measure. We anticipate peace to arrive swiftly, direction to become unmistakable, and our prayers to yield tangible results. But what if none of this happens? What if you persist in showing up, praying, and choosing what is right, yet no dramatic breakthrough occurs? No emotional rush. No sudden clarity. Just another ordinary day on the surface and an unfinished feeling deep inside. Honestly, that kind of faith can feel disappointing, ineffective, even like an absence altogether. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the faith that does the deepest work within you isn't the faith that excites, but the quiet faith that slowly reorders you while life remains unresolved? The Bible returns to this possibility again and again, though most of us overlook it because we're trained to look for fireworks, while Scripture often points to formation. Not the sort that invites celebration, but the kind that quietly shapes a soul in hidden places. Stay with me, because what unfolds here might challenge your understanding of what strong faith really looks like and reveal why the quietest seasons may not be empty at all. The faith that continues breathing even when nothing moves. Let me begin here, because this is usually where frustration starts. There's a kind of spiritual disappointment that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It doesn't resemble rebellion but manifests as consistency without visible reward. You keep praying. You keep exercising restraint. You keep striving to maintain softness where bitterness would be easier. Still, nothing around you seems to shift. The Bible never pretends this experience is rare. It surfaces repeatedly in people who aren't faithless but exhausted. Listen closely to Scripture's language of lament and you hear voices speaking from pressure, not triumph. These individuals aren't standing atop mountains, they're simply enduring long enough to speak honestly. Many of these prayers arise from contexts of instability, invasion, exile, fear, hunger, and extended waiting. This setting is critical because it reveals faith was not always born in calm. Often, it was carried through interruption, delay, and uncertainty. That means this quiet continuation of trust is not a lesser form of belief. In truth, it may be one of the purest expressions. In everyday life, this hidden faith appears where no one typically looks. It shows in how you respond to a message when you're already exhausted, in how you resist immediately defending yourself, in how you preserve your integrity in private, when no applause follows. None of this feels heroic. Most of it feels plain, unremarkable. But perhaps that's precisely the point. Maybe faith does not always announce itself with grandiosity, but rather in its steady, quiet endurance. True spiritual growth isn't about spectacle or grand displays. It's about building a deep, unwavering inner steadiness, one that doesn't hinge on fleeting moods, rewards, or applause. This is a truth I've had to wrestle with in my own life. There are times I've thought that if I don't feel that fiery spiritual intensity, something must be slipping away. But Scripture challenges us to consider something harder. Maybe what feels smaller isn't smaller at all. Maybe it's just quieter, shifting from emotional highs toward a richer, deeper substance. And this brings us to a crucial question we shouldn't rush to answer. If there's nothing around you that proves your faith is working, what makes you so sure it isn't? What happens when heaven doesn't seem to compete with your chaos? This next part is tough because it goes against a common expectation many of us have. Often, we imagine that when God speaks, everything becomes crystal clear, the noise fades away, the confusion lifts, and the answer comes crashing down with undeniable force. Yet, the Bible often tells a different story. There are moments when heaven doesn't burst through the chaos. Life keeps moving as usual. The pressure remains. The same problems stand before you. The person of faith isn't whisked away from the noise. Instead, they learn to notice something deeper within it. Look at Elijah. one of the clearest biblical examples. And remember the context. He wasn't in a peaceful, busy season. He was weighed down by fear, exhaustion, and the aftermath of conflict. Elijah expected God to show up in the ways people usually associate with divine power: the overwhelming, the explosive, the unmistakable. But Scripture turns that expectation on its head. God doesn't appear in violence or spectacle. Instead, what comes is so subtle, it's almost like a whisper so quiet it might be easily missed. A stillness so slight it can be ignored. This isn't just a small detail, it's a profound theological correction. It shows us that God doesn't always reveal himself through dramatic interruptions. Sometimes, his presence emerges in the quiet presence that only becomes noticeable when we stop demanding spectacular signs. Bringing this truth into everyday life can be unsettling. You pray for clarity, but your job remains exhausting. You ask for peace, yet your mind races at midnight. You seek direction, but the path stays unclear. There are no partings of the sky, no emotional certainties. Yet, over time, you begin to notice subtler shifts. You don't react as impulsively. You experience a restraint where panic once took over. You sense a gentle redirection in the way you understand your circumstances. Externally, nothing has changed, the chaos is still there. But internally, a part of you no longer succumbs so easily to that chaos. This kind of transformation is easy to overlook because it doesn't shout loudly enough to stroke the ego. But Scripture suggests that true discernment matures through exactly this kind of silence. Loud answers may be followed without much depth, but quiet guidance demands attention, patience, and a surrendering kind of listening. So maybe, the real question in those silent seasons isn't whether God is absent, but whether we're still willing to hear him in the hush. Imagine a moment when God doesn't respond by drowning out the chaos in your life. What then becomes of your faith, especially when the noise doesn't settle and your circumstances remain unchanged? There are those seasons when nothing around you improves, yet you do. This is a crucial truth that many shy away from. We're naturally drawn to a faith that swoops and unsolves everything, but much less comfortable with a faith that reshapes who we are while life stays stubbornly difficult. Yet, the Scriptures consistently make space for this very experience. Reflect on the wilderness stories. Historically, these journeys weren't just physical paths from one place to another, they represented extended periods of instability. No permanent home to rest in, no clear destination to anticipate, just repetition instead of obvious progress. It was a cycle of moving, waiting, hunger, memory, frustration, hope, and complaint over and over again. And if you read these stories carefully, you sense how the text doesn't rush past the repetition. Instead, it makes you live inside it. Why does this matter? Because the wilderness isn't portrayed as wasted time. It's shown as a revealing time, a season that uncovers what people truly trust when certainty vanishes. It exposes the hidden habits of the heart, bringing buried reactions to light. And notably, God doesn't skip over this uncomfortable process just because it's difficult. In everyday life, this kind of faith is nearly invisible. It's rarely a spectacle. You still carry the same burdens, live in the same body, and face misunderstandings from the same people. But internally, you start to notice subtle shifts. You stop spiraling so quickly, begin to pause before assuming the worst, and learn to maintain faith without needing instant answers to validate it one more day. This transformation isn't flashy, it's deeply formative. Here lies the challenge: many of us want to measure growth through visible markers, new opportunities, relief from pain, open doors, emotional breakthroughs, clear milestones. Yet biblical faith often values endurance as much as achievement. It honors the capacity to stay honest, obedient, and tender-hearted even when there's no immediate proof that anything is working. That doesn't mean your circumstances won't change. It means your faith isn't invalidated when they don't. One way to read Scripture is that God isn't always prepping you for what's next. Sometimes, He's preparing you to fully inhabit where you are now without falling apart. This idea is humbling because it challenges our cultural obsession with rapid progress. So, allow that tension to remain unresolved for now. If life drags on longer than you planned, perhaps your faith isn't failing, it's simply rooting so deeply beneath the surface that it can't be measured by what's visible. The strength that surfaces after your feelings have faded. Real faith often emerges precisely when inspiration has already departed. This isn't a romantic notion, but it might be the truest one. Scripture often portrays strength, not as enthusiasm, but as the steadfast ability to keep going when the emotional fuel is gone. Moses emerges as a crucial figure in this story, not because he appears strong or flawless, but because Scripture doesn't shy away from showing how worn out he was. He asked questions, showed resistance, and carried the heavy burden of responsibility. He wasn't a shining example of unshakable courage. Instead, he kept coming back, kept listening, kept showing up. This is significant because in ancient times, leaders were often expected to display visible strength and confidence. The Scriptures break this mold by portraying a servant of God whose weariness is real and not disqualifying. This matters deeply since many believers quietly assume that feeling exhausted means they are drifting away from God. Yet, the text offers another perspective. Fatigue is what builds up when someone has been faithfully obeying God, often at great personal cost, over a long period. Exhaustion itself isn't automatically holy, but it also isn't a sure sign of failure. In everyday life, this plays out in painfully familiar ways. You rise each morning even when you don't want to. You do the next right thing even without motivation. You treat others with dignity, even when you have almost nothing left to give. You choose not to give in to cynicism, even though it would be easier. At the moment, none of this feels like power. But quietly, it's doing what bursts of excitement can't, teaching the soul to hold steady, even when desire fades. This is a different sort of strength, less about energy and more about endurance. I've had to learn this lesson the hard way. I once thought faith would make me feel stronger and more energetic. Yet, Scripture often portrays faith as a teacher that shows people how to carry their weaknesses without giving in to them, not by denying pain or spiritualizing it, but by refusing to let it have the final word. This tension raises an important, unresolved question. If faith doesn't always remove your fatigue but helps you stay truthful and steady through it, what exactly does it mean to call that season unspirited? Another subtle but profound shift emerges when devotion no longer needs to be seen by others. Early on, being visible can feel reassuring. Shared prayers, public declarations, obvious devotion. There's nothing wrong with these acts. But Scripture gradually reveals a different posture, one in which spiritual life continues quietly, even when unnoticed. Jesus speaks directly to a culture where outward religious acts carried social weight. Prayer, fasting, charity all could boost someone's reputation. This context matters because Jesus' focus on hidden faithfulness isn't random. It's a direct challenge to the kind of spirituality that depends on public recognition. The text doesn't condemn being visible. Instead, it questions relying on visibility as a measure of spiritual health. That question unsettles us deeply because praise and recognition feel emotionally satisfying. Silence doesn't. When your discipline and patience go unnoticed, your motives are refined whether you want them to be or not. Suddenly, devotion becomes less about external validation and more about the heart's quiet commitment. Spiritual life often shifts focus away from outward appearances toward an inner reality, a deeper truth. It's about doing what is right simply because it is right, not for recognition or praise. Though that sounds straightforward, emotionally, it can be quite challenging at first. In everyday life, this hidden devotion can appear almost invisible. It looks like choosing not to lie when no one would ever find out. It looks like holding back bitterness or anger, even when justifying those feelings seems so easy. It looks like allowing love to be quiet and unassuming instead of constantly seeking acknowledgement. These acts are far from glamorous or attention-grabbing, Yet Scripture suggests that these subtle moments are precisely where resilient character takes root. They aren't dramatic or loud. They are deeply anchored. Encouragement and affirmation are natural desires for most people, so this stage of faith can feel disappointing, sometimes even lonely. But perhaps this loneliness is not a punishment. Maybe it represents the moment when faith moves beyond relying on external validation and instead begins to draw strength from a steadier source. A faith that depends on affirmation will falter every time that affirmation disappears. But a faith rooted in conviction continues to move forward even in the dark. This leads us to a profound question that Scripture doesn't rush to answer. If no one ever recognized your faith again, would it still quietly guide your choices with the same unwavering strength? Now, imagine a turning point in faith that's easy to overlook because it doesn't arrive with fanfare. There is no dramatic breakthrough, no triumphant soundtrack playing in the background, just a subtle yet profound change in how a person carries themselves through life. Faith stops panicking not because every question has been answered, but because it stops expecting safety or certainty as a precondition for trust. Throughout Scripture, belief often deepens not after perfect outcomes, but in the midst of disappointment, delays, and shattered hopes. This context is crucial. Many biblical communities preserve these sacred texts not from a place of comfort but from a landscape of instability and insecurity. For those believers, faith wasn't a luxury. It was the very thing that kept them standing upright when certainty was a privilege no one could afford. This teaches us that mature faith isn't defined by the absence of tension or struggle, but rather by how one occupies that tension without being overwhelmed by it. Early faith often bargains: will things work out? Will this journey lead somewhere meaningful? Will it all be worth it? Mature faith doesn't stop caring about the outcomes, but it refuses to let outcomes become the foundation of one's identity. Instead, it asks a different, deeper question: how can I stay faithful, clear-minded, and compassionate right here, right now? This is a remarkable shift. It strips away the illusion that trust guarantees specific results. Yet paradoxically, this belief brings more calm, not less. You stop exhausting yourself with endless rehearsals of every possible future scenario. You make the next right choice without demanding absolute certainty. You release the urge to force clarity where it hasn't yet come. None of this means passivity. On the contrary, it's a practice of emotional and spiritual discipline. It's courage expressed not through bursts of intensity, but through a steady, unwavering presence. I once thought that strong faith meant fewer doubts. But Scripture seems far more comfortable with the reality that doubts may linger and questions may remain. The difference is that those doubts no longer control your every move. Meaning is, faith evolves over time, sometimes in ways we hardly notice until it shifts from something we occasionally lean on to a constant, reliable presence. It's no longer about waiting suspended in uncertainty until everything becomes clear. Instead, faith settles deep into maturity, holding steady even when relief, success, or immediate answers don't come. Imagine if faith no longer promised you quick solutions but instead offered presence, subtle direction, and the grace to keep moving forward. Would that still feel like something worth calling good? This is faith becoming not an event or a series of moments but a lens through which you view all of life. This transformation doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It happens quietly but profoundly. When faith is a lens, it changes how you interpret everything you encounter. The Bible illustrates this beautifully through Jesus. Time and again, he does more than just respond to circumstances, he reframes them entirely. He invites people to reconsider the significance of seeds, bread, birds, coins, delays, storms, meals, and waiting. In the world of the first century, this kind of teaching was more than information. It was a way of seeing. Jesus was training his listeners not just in what to think but in how to see differently. That shift is crucial, because when faith becomes your lens, the world doesn't necessarily become easier, but it becomes more understandable. Delays no longer feel meaningless. Frustration becomes an invitation to insight. Even ordinary conversations begin to reveal what's truly in your heart. You start to grasp that events happening around you are also revealing things about you from within. This change demands attentiveness. It asks you to stay awake rather than react emotionally on autopilot. Practically, this affects your daily life. You listen more carefully. You notice what triggers emotions in you. You take a moment before assuming people's motives. You stop asking only, "How can I get out of this?" and begin asking, "What is this showing me?" This is not self-centeredness but wisdom at work. It turns faith from an abstract belief into a fine-tuned way of perceiving the world. I admit, this approach can be unsettling. Like many, I often crave quick answers, a clear direction to follow right away. But Scripture repeatedly seems less interested in giving direct commands, like "go there now," and more in cultivating discernment. Pay close attention here. That kind of guidance whispers rather than shouts. But perhaps that's why it's more lasting. It doesn't just lead you forward. It matures you along the way. So don't rush this question. Sit with it patiently. If faith isn't presently changing your circumstances outright, but slowly changing the way you interpret them, what new things are you beginning to notice? Things your old self might have missed completely. Finally, let's consider faith that holds steady rather than fixes. This phase calls for careful reflection because your faith becomes less about triumphant breakthroughs and more about enduring weight. Sometimes faith isn't about building something new but about holding on to what remains. Scripture dwells on these moments without trying to neatly resolve them. Take Job, for example, the epitome of this kind of faith. His story, deeply embedded in wisdom literature, doesn't offer tidy answers. His friends babble on without understanding. His certainties collapse. His pain stretches beyond explanation. Yet through it all, Job's faith does something extraordinary. It refuses to give up or leave the conversation entirely. And maybe that is one of the most honest and profound definitions of faith, not just a belief that solves, but a faithful presence that holds on through uncertainty and suffering. In the entire Bible, true trust is not about blindly agreeing with everything, nor is it about an unwavering optimism or perfect emotional clarity. It's more about refusing to give up or walk away. This kind of trust is serious and steadfast. It doesn't need to perform or impress, it just persists, often looking messy and imperfect. The biblical text acknowledges this by allowing space for protest, confusion, and the raw, strained voice of the human soul. This recognition is crucial because it shows that faith, at this stage, isn't about pretending or maintaining illusions. It is stripped down to its bare essence. When certainty fades, language fails, and momentum slows, what remains might not seem remarkable, but it can still be deeply real and authentic. In everyday life, this grounded faith emerges when you resist the urge to quickly escape discomfort. You don't rush to manufacture meaning or fake a sense of peace. Instead, you continue to live responsibly, accepting the discomfort, surrendering the need to force resolutions before the truth is ready to unfold. This kind of restraint isn't weakness, it's a mark of moral seriousness. It means choosing reality over dramatics or spiritual performance. While I often gravitate toward faith that builds up, energizes, and expands, Scripture honors the faith that simply holds firm. One kind stretches you outward, the other roots you inward. And perhaps this inward-rooted faith only becomes possible after the first type has stripped away illusions. So let the question rest where it belongs. If every support you once clung to, bit explanations, momentum, reassurance, or emotional intensity falls silent, what part of your faith would still stand strong enough to carry you through life? When faith begins to reshape your inner life, it's a transformation few anticipate. Faith doesn't just change what you believe, it subtly reorganizes your internal world. Thoughts that once dominated lose their power. Reflexive responses that felt natural now seem off kilter. The Bible hardly dramatizes this slow, nearly imperceptible process. Yet suddenly you find yourself reacting differently than before. The New Testament letters, addressed to communities facing pressure, misunderstanding, and social vulnerability, repeatedly emphasize this inner transformation. Not because life was easy, but precisely because it was hard. Faith didn't erase hardship, it restructured people from within amid hardship. Patience became possible. Self-control surfaced. A deeper calm arose, one that wasn't dependent on external comfort. This is a profound point. Spiritual maturity isn't just about what you profess with your mouth. It's about what no longer controls your inner world. Fear may visit, but it doesn't dominate the dialogue. Anger may flare up, but it doesn't sit on the throne. Anxiety might speak, but it no longer speaks alone. This internal shift has practical consequences. You find the ability to rest without needing to constantly justify yourself. You permit some issues to remain unresolved without being consumed by them. You stop feeling the need to win every argument to feel safe. This isn't passivity, it's stability. It makes life more livable and peace more functional rather than just theoretical. I used to expect spiritual growth to feel monumental and dramatic. Yet Scripture embraces growth that unfolds quietly, steadily, and profoundly inside. Let's take a moment to rethink the nature of faith, not as a relentless surge of intensity, but as a steady, honest dip. Picture it not as constant highs, but as a steady, internal harmony that brings calm. This could explain why mature faith often feels more subdued than immature faith, yet it stands far more enduring over time. Now, I want you to hold on to this question: if your faith is quietly reshaping how you think, how you respond to life's challenges, how you rest and endure even without dramatic or flashy moments, would you recognize that as genuine transformation? Or might you dismiss it simply because it arrived quietly, without fanfare? We're talking about a faith that survives beyond the very moment, that spark tied a faith designed not just for crisis or a fleeting intense season, but for a lifetime stretching long beyond the initial revelation. Scripture captures this kind of endurance with sober respect. Many biblical figures trusted promises they never saw fully fulfilled in their own lifetime. They lived between generations, navigating the space between the spoken word and its eventual fulfillment, between planting seeds and waiting for the harvest. The biblical text doesn't validate them by visible outcomes or immediate success. Instead, the true measure is consistency, their choice to stay aligned with God's promises even when the results belong to a future they couldn't control or witness. This is a hard truth, inviting us to reconsider what success really means. Faith becomes less about finishing the race and more about faithfully contributing along the way. It's less about personal closure and more about keeping the thread unbroken for those who come after. It means planting trees whose shade you may never sit under. It means making decisions rooted in truth, not applause. It means allowing your obedience to matter, even if the full meaning unfolds later, maybe in ways you'll never directly see. In everyday life, this changes our relationship with time. We stop demanding instant proof that our efforts were worthwhile. We invest in others without clutching tightly to the returns. We prioritize values even when visible rewards are absent. Faith thus becomes more like stewardship, a commitment to care and cultivate, rather than a rush toward immediate gratification. This doesn't make faith less meaningful, in fact. It makes it far more durable. I admit, I like closure. Most people do. But Scripture often leaves its most powerful threads open on purpose. Perhaps faith is not meant to tie every knot while we're still holding the rope. Sometimes faith's purpose is to stay true enough so someone else can pick up the line later and continue. So let's leave this question open, without rushing to a conclusion. If your faith shapes choices whose full meaning might only become clear later or through someone else's journey, would you still call that a life worth trusting? This is the quiet faith that transforms more than it can immediately prove. This is not the story most expect. We're conditioned to seek transformations that are visible, countable, and definable. But Scripture often directs us elsewhere, to deep change born through unnoticed obedience. Think of the person who keeps praying when prayer feels ordinary or dull, of someone who chooses integrity, even when compromise is easier, of a small community that relentlessly practices mercy. These quiet acts create a foundation that lasts far beyond the fleeting moments of drama or visible triumph. In a world driven by transactions and visible outcomes, many of the most compelling stories of faith actually come from the margins, people without public power or cultural dominance. Their faith, while not immediately obvious or dramatic, has quietly reshaped history over time. Jesus himself often used imagery that reflected this subtle, yet profound transformation: yeast in dough, seed in soil, light that steadily guides. These metaphors, rooted in their cultural context, emphasize process over spectacle, change from within, influence through permeation rather than force or domination. This perspective has profound implications for how we measure whether faith is working. Instead of focusing on what faith achieves publicly, perhaps faith is best seen in what it quietly sustains: honesty, compassion, endurance, steadiness, integrity, and a hope that refuses to turn bitter or cruel. These qualities seldom make headlines, yet they are precisely the forces that gradually transform lives, families, and entire communities. Personally, I've had to rethink my assumptions here. I once believed that if faith truly mattered, it would be immediately evident, undramatic. But Scripture offers a different view. Perhaps the most world-changing faith is the kind that no one applauds as it unfolds. This faith simply keeps choosing truth long enough that reality itself bends and changes because of it. So here's the final question I want to leave with you, without trying to wrap it up too neatly. If the faith that truly transforms the world is quiet, patient, and mostly invisible while it's growing, how would that shift the way you evaluate your own spiritual life today? Throughout this reflection, one thread has stood out: faith often doesn't announce its work with fanfare. Instead, it operates in waiting, fatigue, repetition, unseen acts of obedience, and the long discipline of staying honest when pretending certainty would be easier. It's not louder or flashier, it's simply more deeply rooted. And maybe that's why it endures. Perhaps the faith that's changing you most isn't the one that stirs the strongest feelings, but the one teaching you how to remain present, truthful, and aligned even when nothing dramatic happens to prove that it matters. So take a moment and sit with this honestly. If faith is shaping who you are becoming more than what you achieve, what would need to change in how you measure your journey with God? If this message has connected with where you are right now, share in the comments which part stayed with you the longest. Your words might bring clarity and encouragement to someone else. And if you want to explore this quieter, deeper side of faith further, stay tuned to this channel. The next message will delve even deeper into the hidden mistakes people often make. As faith matures, mistakes that seem harmless at first but quietly distort everything if they go unspoken.